Hello, beautiful community. Are you? Are you here? And are you able to hear me? And if the answer is yes, then we're going to go to our ritual of honoring the people who left questions right at the beginning. And I can see there's quite a few, and they look good. So let's jump there. Grant, you can hear. Hi, Suzanne. Hi, Rachel. Hi, Julia. Julia, you have a question today. Everybody, Jessica, fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. It is a hot, almost clammy evening here in East London. My favorite time of the year in London is sort of August, September time. And the city just kind of opens up to the world and kind of feels more international, actually, than at any other point. It's sort of open onto itself and open onto the world. So we aren't in August or September yet, but this feels like a kind of August or September night. Ross, is amazing to have you with me. And you're asking a sort of gloomy question. We're going to start with you. Rachel is asking, London is not international. So London started on a very high level, not just as a European, but as an international city. And to me, I'm going to just gossip about trivial things for a minute and I'll jump to the questions. For me, what really matters is that a city feels not just European, but international. Like, can I access Africa? Can I access the Middle East by being here? And I don't want it to be just Italy or Germany or Spain. And London started at a high level before Brexit, and it's been going down. But it started at such a high level that it's still pretty high up. But the trend is downward. London is becoming less of an international city and less of a European city. So, and that's kind of paradoxical. You might think it'll just become less of a European city, but no, it's becoming less of both. But it started at a very high level. In other words, it's got such an extraordinary concentration of fascinating people here, that it probably could still beat any European capital. If you gather the 10,000 most interesting folks in the city, they might just be a bit more interesting than the folks in Paris or Rome. But the trend is down, but it's just hanging on because it started at a very high level. Maybe the two most powerful cities from that point of view, from the point of view of the arts as well, are London and New York. Ross, some say Ukraine joining NATO is the only way Ukraine will ever be really secure. But if Putin wants to challenge Article 5, will that make a real difference? Yes, Ross, my view is that it will make a real difference. But it's also true that Mr. Putin's project right from the beginning was a large-scale escalation against the West that got halted in Ukraine because Ukraine stood up, because Putin got things wrong, and because we stood up and backed Ukraine to a good extent, at least. There is an alternate universe in which Putin waits for longer and starts a war in 2026, not 2022, and that war involves some kind of incursion into, let us say, Estonia. That's possible. That was a sort of genuine counterfactual that was available to us. And there's even a video of me on the main channel sitting around 2 or 3 years ago, wondering about the risks of a Putin incursion into the Baltics. So here's what I would say. The West needs to give Ukraine powerful and real security guarantees. And I think Ukraine probably gets the best kind of security guarantee that it needs, and probably we want for it to have, via being a member of NATO, so that Russia knows that it's essentially looking at World War III or nothing. There's nothing in between World War III and sort of zero incursion onto Ukrainian territory. Now, that in of itself does not break Putin's expansive imperial project, but it's a pretty strong line of safety. And to a certain extent, then we're left with the question, well, is there anything we can do to sort of guarantee that Putin won't start World War III at some point? And the answer to that is no. There's nothing we can do. So I think that Ukraine in NATO is a very powerful security guarantee, but there is nothing we can do short of us waiting until Putin runs out of capacity or Putin getting overthrown to reduce the risk of some kind of escalation from Putin against NATO or not NATO, right? There's no way to just eliminate that risk, Russ. That's sort of what I would say. So the answer is it makes a huge difference, but there is nothing that, as it were, makes all the difference in the world and simply disables Putin. Bernard, fantastic question. What do you think are the most important things we are not seeing or understanding in this war? I think to some extent it depends on who we are, right? And let's acknowledge our presence in a certain kind of algorithmically mediated bubble. But it's a fantastic question. I mean, let me list in the order of priority a few things. I do think that nuclear risk is one. I think that there are people who take nuclear risk very seriously and oppose supporting Ukraine, but not enough people take nuclear risk seriously and support Ukraine and firmly stand behind the idea of not giving in to nuclear blackmail, right? So we've got to be serious. We don't give in, but we also recognize the risk. And something extraordinary occurred in the last few weeks in Russia that we could talk about, which is a kind of a proliferation of discussion about Russia using nuclear weapons among various kinds of members of the strategic commentariat. And some of them said very worryingly hawkish things like preemptive nuclear strikes and so on. And we shouldn't over worry about this or take this too far, but this is not just propaganda. This is in part a case of things being outsourced by the Kremlin, that some people need to say for the benefit of the Kremlin, but it's also about these pieces trying to ingratiate themselves with the Kremlin by replicating some of the conversations going on in the Kremlin. And here we move from sort of these genuinely trivial screamings about nuclear Armageddon by the propaganda on TV that you see. We move from that to more serious Russian commentators talking about it. And in that way, we really have to acknowledge that we're moving to some extent from a pure realm of hyperactivity and propaganda to a realm of worldview. And it is part of Putin's mission, the return in 2012, that he does think about nuclear risk seriously. And sometimes, in some cases, we need military experts, nuclear experts, to educate us about nuclear risk. This is not one of them. Because what's unclear and up for debate here is not how Russian nuclear weapons work and who will obey what command. That's interesting too. But what's up for debate here is what kind of conversations they're having in the Kremlin. And it doesn't mean they mean it. It doesn't mean they're going to do it if they're saying we're going to nuke the West in the Kremlin. But if they're having these conversations, which I think they are, we've got to recognize that this is this kind of hysteria also seeping into what we can call just worldview and not just manipulation. One thing. Second, I think the precarity, and I'm aware that there are questions coming in. I'm gonna catch up a bit. The precarity of Western democracies that I regularly talk about is another factor we underestimate. I think also we underestimate in this bubble the hesitancy of the West, that the West backs Ukraine's survival but doesn't back a Ukrainian victory all the way. What else? I think there is a systematic underestimation of Ukrainian agency that goes beyond what we actually think. That's to say, there is disgraceful underestimation of Ukrainian agency um, on the side of folks who want to, as it were, give Ukraine away to the Russians. But there is actually a little bit of underestimation or evasion of Ukrainian agency going on in the pro-Ukraine side, right? There's not enough constructive, positive conversation about Ukraine. There's a lot of conversation that is anti-Russia, right? And I think that's something. I think that the pro-Ukraine tribe and some of the NATO folks too are not giving enough attention to Ukrainian agency. Interesting. And I actually think some Ukrainian intellectuals are not giving enough attention to Ukrainian agency too. And the Ukrainian philosopher Andrei Baumeister recently came out and said that there are some colleagues of his who can't stop talking about how they want to cancel Dostoevsky and Pushkin, but they talk about canceling Dostoevsky and Pushkin so much that it seems to me that they themselves can't live without them. And that if they really wanted to cancel Dostoevsky and Pushkin, they should focus on constructive, positive Ukrainian conversations, right? And not just these conversations about what we must be against and in what way and how everybody must align. So it's an underestimation of of the need for exploration of Ukrainian agency that happens via a kind of import of Western identity politics. The only other thing I would say is perhaps that we're not talking enough about politicizing the Russian space. There's a lot of posturing. Andrei Baumeister is a Ukrainian philosopher, public intellectual. He's a proper academic philosopher. He's also on YouTube, interestingly enough. So there's a lot of sort of almost obscenely banal stuff said about stuff that's meant to happen on Russian territory, but there's not enough done along the lines of, yeah, I can spell his name. Or maybe I can't spell his name. So we need to, goodness sake, politicize the Russian space more. Now, I'm going to run through this a bit more quickly. Kimberly, hi Vlad, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the reports that Russia has mined the Zaporizhia power plant cooling pond. Is this likely to be a legitimate claim? I can tell you this. At the level of political analysis, I can't do any sort of technical analysis, and I can't assess that claim, I'm afraid, within my lane. But Russia is not interested in escalation, at least in the sense of internationalization and globalization of the conflict. It wants this to be a Russia-Ukraine deal as much as possible for as long as possible. And so you can see how Kakhovka does not quite activate the West and Western citizens. In fact, it has a kind of a climate crisis sort of impact. In other words, there is a sort of drama to it that is very significant, but there is an absence of a sense of emergency that genuine human and political and social drama goes with, ecological drama goes with, that we don't react much. And that is not going to be the case with a nuclear incident. There will be a reaction. So, simply on the basis of that, you can come up with a reason why the Russians are absolutely capable of making a nuclear mess. But there's at least grounds for them not to be interested in doing that soon. A counter argument might be that a nuclear incident might, in the view of the Russians, scare Western citizens, but it's clearly going to have just the opposite effect. So, at the level of political analysis, whatever you think about the Russian intent there, you've got to fit it in with the nearly indisputable analysis, I think, that the Russians do not want to escalate now. Kostas is asking, what are your thoughts on how the war has and will continue to affect the popularity of far-right movements as well as the ideologies of those movements themselves? I don't think it'll have a dramatic effect, but these movements will increasingly proliferate. And there's a problem on the right, which is that there's bits of the right that are falling off the democratic spectrum and are becoming anti-constitutional. And moreover, we're not recognizing that. When the left, or what we wrongly call the left, goes nuts, we recognize that and we say, ooh, something has gone wrong there. But when the right goes nuts, and to some extent, we've got a little bit of quite a bit of both in Western societies. But what's called the left isn't really the left; it's a sort of illiberal liberalism that's going on. But when the right goes off, we don't notice it, and we think the same normality is going on as before when it isn't. Right? That's why I'm so clear about making statements like Boris Johnson is not a pro-democratic politician. Right? You have to be very clear in how you categorize people. It doesn't matter what his support for Ukraine is. Boris Johnson is not a politician who is committed to democratic procedure and democratic ritual, the way people who are extremely right-wing often are. This is not an ideological spectrum thing. So we have to watch that. And that there's much more extreme stuff than that going on, and it'll only continue. In some way, the default drift of European democracies is toward a kind of barely democratic right authoritarianism. We'll talk much more about this. Lucas, Vlad, my favorite video of yours is about evil. How many people in the administration do you believe are truly convinced, and how many are just indifferent follows? At the top is hard to judge, but at the very top, if you narrow the circle, it's 100%. But then you're talking about 4 or 5 people. They're all convinced. If you broaden it out, you could get 50-50. If you broaden it out even more and you talk about the 1,000 people at the top of the regime, then probably 2/3 don't buy this stuff, right? And if you broaden it out even further, then that 2/3 could grow even more. In other words, Putin's project is hyper-conservative, hyper-reactionary on Russia's own cultural terms, and that even applies to some people in the regime. Yulia. Hello, Vlad. Why is Zaporizhia power plant not under the control of the international organization? I would assume most countries have an interest to prevent radioactive contamination. Well, it obviously, how nuclear power plants work and nuclear safety is not my lane. So let me give you a bad answer. That is a political answer. For us to say that should happen, we need an account of political agency. And that's to say, who is going to do what, how, when, and by what means. And that probably requires 2 things. International institutions and procedures of the kind we don't have, and both sides in the conflict, including Russia, agreeing that Zaporizhia is not to be used for, exploitative purposes, and that Russia is not to take it as a political hostage. Short of that, it's not clear to me what can be done. And one thing we can be certain about is that Russia is absolutely going to exploit Zaporizhia as it sees fit. Grant. Hello, Grant. Do you feel we will get to a time where we agree that victory for Ukraine is the desired result? That we, all Western powers, is it possible that um, powers are looking at each other, wondering who'll make the call first? Does it have to be something Biden does? Or do the US see different countries as being in the lead spot here to make that announcement? Maybe Poland, Germany, UK. The United States is in the lead relative to Europe taken as a whole. The United States is more in favor of Charles, no worries, good to have you. And thank you. The United States is in the lead, and it's not the United States position, it's just not American policy that Ukraine should retake Crimea. The United States isn't necessarily against that, but that is not American policy. And Ukraine has not been armed commensurate with that goal. What could create a situation where the West unites behind that goal of simply trying to get Ukraine to win as soon as possible? It could be Russia engaging in some very major escalation, right? A major nuclear escalation. That's possible. In my last video on the main channel, I explained what the West needs to do to get Ukraine closer to winning. And that is more than what we're doing now. But what I do is I stop a little bit short of an unconditional commitment to Ukrainian victory, but I take things in that direction. So I think we're falling short of where we need to be in terms of our own strategic interests. So no, I don't think, Grant, that people are looking around wondering who's going to make the announcement first. The United States is simply applying its somewhat hesitant but supportive position in practice. Macro, micro, do you have any thoughts on the former Duma member Ilya Ponomaryov, who is the only one in that parliamentary body in 2014 who voted against the annexation of Crimea and his association with the Freedom of Russia Legion? People have the right to evolve, and so we need to see what Ilya Ponomaryov does. So far, I do not recognize him as a meaningful actor, and I do not recognize him as a meaningful Russian oppositional actor. At the moment, he is an actor who is intervening in various ways on Ukraine's side in the informational environment. At the moment, one of the few things the Russian opposition can agree on, they can't agree on much, is that Ilya Ponomaryov isn't one of them. And there's all kinds of memes going about with pictures of the Dead Sea and Ilya next to it, saying, the Dead Sea, I killed it. And that's to say that he's developed a reputation, not entirely unfounded, for taking responsibility for oppositional and partisan activity in Russia that isn't happening. So with Ilya at the moment, there's a question whether he's any kind of a Russian actor at all. He may be somebody who has, as it were, migrated onto surfing Ukraine's informational environment and propping on Ukraine's info war. You can assess what he does in that aspect. But today, this could change next year. You never know. I don't fully recognize him as a meaningful Russian oppositional actor. And I'd say the same about the Freedom of Russia Legion. Okay, let's do a bit of catch up because these were questions that we took from the beginning. Pool, do you think COVID delayed Putin with this idea of a war? No. I think that if anything, COVID made the war more likely, and the war would have been less likely to happen had Putin not been doing his COVID isolation. Eric, how does Russia work demographically? You have wildly different peoples in Moscow compared to Siberia, Tatars, Yakuts, and so on. At the level of politics, the biggest gap is age, not region or ethnicity. Older people, and above all, older women buy Putin's story. Younger people overwhelmingly don't. So the younger you get in Russia, the more you sort of get to a position where people just think, why do you need to attack a neighboring country? I mean, are you completely insane? And the further up you go in terms of the age groups, it's whatever Mr. Putin does is probably right. I want to be careful here, so maybe I'm going to stay away from politics, but what Mr. Putin's doing is probably right. That's the attitude. So that's the single biggest thing. I think that the thing that Russia is massively suffering from is egregious anti-democratic centralization, where in a completely obscene way, different regions are run from Moscow with various kinds of corrupt appointments just helicoptered in, which end up deciding the fates of different regions of the country. It's worth saying that ethnic Russians represent a big number in a lot of these regions that are portrayed as being ethnically dominant in the West, but actually aren't. We've got to be careful there. And there's a deep need for radical decentralization of this whole story, which is being run, Eric, in the most egregious way from Moscow. And if that decentralization doesn't happen, the next thing on the agenda might be something more radical. There is no demand for it at the moment, except stuff coming out of the West and Ukraine. There is no native demand for segregation, separation of Russia into bits. That could arise. It's not there at the moment. Word of the day, Russplaining. For me, it's a bit like Russism. It has no explanatory value. Insofar as Russism, so it's just an abusive word at Russians. Okay, I mean, Russia is in a very bad way. Culture is quite sick. You can do it, but there's nothing to Russism, for example, either, that you can't just capture by fascization, discussion of fascization. Let us have a look. Rick, thank you. We're over 1,000 people. Welcome, everybody. Balmy. Yes, London. Don't know how to say that word. I'm curious about corruption in Ukraine, or if you have any. So, no, David, I'm not going to talk too much about it now. It's a theme that's coming up more now in Ukraine as the war has gone on. But it's not. We're not looking at Russia level corruption, but it's a very important conversation for Ukraine's post-war evolution, and it's certainly a problem. It's a systemic problem, and while it needs to be addressed, in my opinion, I don't think corruption will be one of the main or the main challenge Ukraine, for example, has won the war would face. I think there's going to be other challenges. So I'm not somebody who's very panicked about that being something that they can't handle. Dan, absolutely. Russia always wants us to think they're willing to escalate. Hims, thank you so much. Raskalikov. Tim Snyder, who is beautiful, but is a bit of an activist these days rather than an analyst. Tim Snyder, who is very, very beautiful, said in a recent interview that Russia's deepest unspoken fear is not the West, NATO, but China. He didn't expand, but are you able to provide? I'd love to know what Tim thinks. Russia does not have, Russian elites do not have a paranoid relationship with China the way they do with NATO and the West. The idea that they've been betrayed by NATO and the West is not a made up story. It's real. Putin feels it almost at a traumatic level, which is why they can now take significant steps toward becoming um, a state so dependent in economic terms on China and inevitably in time more politically dependent on China too. So I think China is a very big fear for the Russian opposition, who are terrified of Putin's turn toward China, and not a positive turn toward China, a turn toward China in which China will benefit from being able to exploit Russia's weakness in all kinds of ways. Now, the Russian elite doesn't want to sell out to China in that way, but it's an inevitable byproduct of something they're much more exercised about, which is their conflict with the West. There is a kind of a fantasy overall in Russia of multipolarity, with Russia being one of the major poles. But apart from Putin's self-immolating imperialist project being doomed to failure, there is also the point that if there is going to be a multipolar world, it's going to be a bipolar world with the United States and China. If there's going to be anybody else is going to be India. Russia's not going to be one of these major players. It doesn't have an appropriate way of joining a triad or a dyad like that except through nuclear blackmail, which is interestingly why nuclear blackmail will increasingly be Russia's main tool of foreign policy. But I'd love to know what you meant. Rachel is saying Ilya skipped over to Ukraine. I'm just catching up with comments. I think I'm not going to talk about Ilya. He's actually a bit different to some of these people. But there are some Russians who have become honorary Ukrainians. And I make a very serious ethical point here. Not impressed with you, Russians, who've become honorary Ukrainians, have tried to be honorary Ukrainians. Russians need to take responsibility for this war qua Russians. It's an evasion of responsibility to say, oh, now Russia is so terrible. I used to be a Russian, but I can't even stand being a Russian anymore. I'm basically going to pretend I'm Ukrainian now. It doesn't work like that. It's depoliticization. It's a failure to take responsibility. I'm not impressed with these Russian entrepreneurial entrepreneurial Russian Ukrainians. Unsoft. Russian opposition is often accused of waiting for something. Sanctions, Ukrainian victory, elites changing their mind. Maxim Katz is waiting for the next elections in Russia. Is that a smart thing to do? So what Katz means when he says he's waiting for the next election is that the next election is a moment of vulnerability for the regime, not in the sense that there's going to be an election that's real, which they need to win, not at all. It's rather that the artifice of the fake election needs to proceed with an adequate and non-turbulent acclimatizing reaction from the depoliticized blob in the middle. If the blob is quiet, that means, okay, the monarch has rechosen himself, and by the lack of turbulence, you can see that people are with him. That'll be the claim that's made, and it's going to work. If that's not quite that easy, Katz thinks it could be an opportunity for politicization. So what Katz is saying, it's going to be an opportunity for politicizing the Russian space. I think one of Katz's feelings is that he doesn't want people to waste themselves by protesting against a brick wall, as it were, and as it were, confiscating themselves from a near future protest movement where they're going to be needed. You don't want to be in jail for an ineffective political act when you're going to be perhaps soon needed, to join in an effective political act. Where I think this analysis is right is that protest in Russia is not an effective political act until there is a crack in the regime. And when there is a crack in the regime, then we'll see the Russian opposition really tested. Can they tell effective political stories? Can they mobilize people? Can they speak beyond their bubble of the liberal, pro-Western folks that represent a small percentage of the population? Then they're going to be tested. But unless your tyranny is in decline and has cracked, there's not much you can do by going out onto the street, I'm afraid. And that's why we've got to be careful about false analogies. Even so protests, the Maidan, for example, has nothing to do with this situation. Right? That was a situation where there's real political conflict in the political system. You weren't going up against a brick wall. Even in Belarus, you had much more of a situation in 2020 of a regime in decline, and a weakening regime in decline. People came out. That weakness is not manifested yet in Russia. So that's the kind of argument these people are making. Can you challenge it? Yes, you can. And of course, it's worth pointing out that how effective protest is in part a matter of how effective people think it is, right? So there's a little bit of thinking that makes it so to this too. But that's the story. My own objection to the Russian opposition isn't that they are waiting for things to happen. It's that they are themselves too depoliticized in their discourse. They're engaging with the business of what happens on the Russian space as though they were broadcasters, commentators, activists, not politicians. Mr. Navalny is virtually the only real politician there. You might hate him, you might love him, doesn't matter. But he's a politician. He's a guy who politicizes. He's not a guy who does moral prescriptions or ethical condemnations. He's a political guy. He's a guy who politicizes. So that's the test for the Russian opposition. Can they act politically and therefore constructively. Milan. In Slovakia, it seems nobody's voting for liberal or progressive parties. 70% of people vote conservative and ultra-conservative. Well, what is happening here? Well, we are having a global trend of democratic backsliding, which we can't fully arrest. And they've got a problem with the fact that liberal and progressive parties are appealing to a public good that most citizens no longer buy into. This is a very difficult conversation whereby the typical liberal project and the typical progressive project, add labels as you please, doesn't matter what we're really talking about, but a lot of centrist, center-left and center-right political projects indeed no longer make sense because the social fabric they require has ceased to exist progressively. You need societies, as my colleague Mark Liller says, to be conservative in a certain way, not conservative ideologically, but you need societies to be sufficiently integrated, sufficiently together, sufficiently sharing in a joint sense of cooperation and belonging as citizens. And our societies are doing this at the moment. They're untethering. And this is really, really difficult because you can't bring them back together just sort of by doing moral cries for the glory of democracy. No, you need to reckon with social forces that have limited the capacity of democracy. Got to get realistic about those forces, and then we've got to say, given these inherent limitations, what are our possibilities for democratic regeneration? And I think there are resources we have in that direction. How do we make people feel that they can touch politics? It's a feeling people are losing. How do we consolidate counter-majoritarian institutions like the institution of journalism and the institution of academia and expertise? How do we minimize, that's less true of Eastern Europe, I must say, but how do we minimize identity politics in favor of discourse of citizen belonging, etc., etc.? These are conversations we must have. Nancy, thank you so much. Larry is asking, is there a danger that the more Ukraine pushes into Crimea? Well, no, there is not enough of a danger of that, I'm afraid, at the moment. So my worry is that Ukraine isn't as close as I'd like it to be to pushing into Crimea, not the other way around. That Russia becomes so unstable, and that becomes a bigger worry than the issue of Ukraine not retaking Crimea. So there's a paradox here. A tiny minority of online activists are dramatically exaggerating the odds of Russia breaking up. And what that curiously misses, if you just focus on that online activism, is that Western policymakers are at the opposite extreme. They are probably overly nervous about Russia breaking up. They're overly nervous about it as a real possibility, perhaps, than they should be. And it's an interesting debate. Are they overly nervous about what the consequences of that would be in practice? Somebody like Alexander Etkin would argue yet that yes, they are. So absolutely, there is still this worry in the West. What if Russia begins to fall apart? Isn't that worse than Ukraine not getting Crimea? That's absolutely a thought in major Western capitals, in the power centers. And two, an even less reasonable thought, much less reasonable thought, that sadly is very prominent. What if we get somebody worse than Putin? And that is actually a thought that I strongly advise not entertaining, because I don't know, first of all, what it means to be worse than Putin unless you just start World War III. And secondly, um, I'm going to say something farcical that does not remotely represent reality. If Mr. Prigozhin became president tomorrow, he'd try to stop the war. That's a sort of cartoonish way of making a point. So I don't think we should worry as much as we are worried in the West about what if somebody worse than Putin comes. I think that we should say that Putin's pretty close to the bottom, and that at least is not something we should worry about too much. Suvara, hi. Would absolute and explicit rejection of violence by organization be seen as something other than condemnation of those who use it? Should such condemnation be launched at a people who have no way to protest peacefully? I think it's me. Let's try again. I don't get what you're asking. Would explicit and absolute rejection of violence by an organization be seen as something other than condemnation of those who use it? Can you tell me what you're talking about? You're talking about protesting in Russia? Try that again on me. No, don't no need for another super thanks. Just drop it in the comments. I'll try to catch it. Sorry, I'm lost. It could be me. It could be just fuzzy. Rock, there is no single way to stop corruption in Russia. There are going to be difficult ways to stop it, but there are going to be also easier ways to stop it. One of them is going to be just getting the courts to work, which is a kind of a negative action. It's just going to be to stop politically prescribing legal processes. But then there's going to have to be massive political restructuring. And of course, ultimately, you need a political culture. A lot of the things that we find most admirable in the most functional democracies and in the least corrupt democracies is based not just on institutions, but on ritual. And these institutions are themselves based on ritual. So, rituals of bureaucratic adequacy, of transparency, are important. And once transgressed enough times, they melt away, and are very, very hard to rebuild. You can rebuild them if there's a long history of good procedural stuff, sort of stuff that's absent in Russia. Suvara, you want to re-ask? Dan, is RFK Jr. worth thinking about? Absolutely. He is an intervener in the informational environment. And it raises a lot of questions about discourse, about expertise, this conflict between Joe Rogan and Peter Hotez. Suvara, if the Russian organization is located outside Russia proclaims explicit rejection of violence, could it be seen as anything other than condemning those who use it in Russia? I'm going to try. I'm still struggling. I'm going to try. So, the Russian opposition isn't unified. It's a whole bunch of little islets. So if one islet says, we're not going to organize anything on Russian territory that involves violence, that doesn't mean that others can't have a different approach. So from that point of view, no, doesn't mean that. Moreover, it could be that these groups decide that there's certain things they can't ethically ask people to do, but they're not opposed to them doing. So, for instance, recently, Navalny's organization, when they tried to organize protests that really were very, very limited globally, but also in Russia, they said globally Russians come out, but Russians who are in Russia, see for yourselves. If you come out, you're a hero. These could be the consequences. If you don't come out, these are the potential advantages of not coming out. So see how you go. So what I think is really important is this very key ethical principle. And the problem with that ethical principle is that you only find out where you stand in relation to its verdict over you after time passes. And here is the principle. You can't put people's necks on the line unless putting their necks on the line makes a difference. That's the key ethical principle for somebody like Mr. Navalny. So if Mr. Navalny, over the next 2 years, let's say, directly or indirectly organizes something that gets several thousand Russians to lose their livelihoods or lose their freedom or lose their lives even, the way we're going to judge him isn't going to be on the day. It's going to be at the end. It's going to be, as it were, a matter of ethical luck for him, whether this works out. And so this is a very important idea too. There is such a thing as moral luck. If you're a political leader who sacrifices a bunch of people and then things don't work out, you carry a different kind of responsibility for what happened than if you sacrifice them in a way that then led to things working out. So that's, I think, the key ethical frame in which I would look at anybody trying to organize oppositional activity in tyrannical regimes. You can put people's necks on the line, but you live with the ethical consequences if it turns out that it was all for nothing. But we've got to be careful what all for nothing means too, right? Because you might say, well, the protests in Belarus were all for nothing. But that's absolutely not true. What the protests in Belarus achieved is actually a lot. They have given, as Greg Oden, the wonderful Russian political philosopher, said the other day, they have given Belarusians the right to um, talk from the position of their future selves once they've liberated themselves from um, the Lukashenko regime that's taken them hostage, right? Something Russia doesn't have. Russia, we can't quite as straightforwardly say that Mr. Putin has taken Russians hostage. He has probably more than people think, but it's not quite as clear as it is in Belarus. There's a lot of Russians who are sort of acclimatized to the regime. So this is a key principle, I would say. You can put people's necks on the line, but then it's going to be your ethical luck how that turns out. I mean, as a great philosopher once gave the example of Gauguin abandoning his family and going to paint in Tahiti. And how we judge Gauguin in part actually depends on the quality of his masterpieces. And that's a matter of moral luck. If Gauguin had abandoned his family and gone to Tahiti and failed artistically, we would have a different ethical attitude toward him abandoning his family. It still remains an ethical wrong, but it's sort of counterweighed by aesthetic value. And so Gauguin abandoned his family and then went on to paint some of the greatest masterpieces in the history of Western art. Now, that changes the story. That is Gauguin's moral luck, but it doesn't make it right to abandon his children as he did, having painted agonizingly loving portraits of them. It's all minor. I'm not going to answer your question fully about who you should read in the 19th century. Give Alexander Herzen a go. That's how you spell Herzen or Gerzen in Russian. He is, in some people's view, Russia's greatest 19th century thinker. I'm not going to defend that claim now. In many ways, he was made famous by Isaiah Berlin, the great 20th century intellectual, British public intellectual. And at one point, Isaiah's collection of Herzen was incomplete and was completed by my own. And so Isaiah's collection of Herzen at Oxford merged with mine. Isaiah died 26 years ago. On a more banal note, you could read some Russians today, and I would say read the Russian political philosopher Greg Oden, for example, who I just mentioned recently, young guy in his 30s, one of the very best commentators on the war. Sebastian, yes, Gauguin's behavior was absolutely appalling, and in his less great masterpieces, the extraordinary, exploitative, the feverishly exploitative gaze raises ethical question marks about these paintings, which Gauguin transcends, question marks. Spelling of Greg Oden. You know Greg Oden. But in his great masterpieces like Nevermore or Who Are We, Where Are We Going, he transcends this question. A lot of people haven't been arrested. It's risky to be in Russia. He was in the USA for a bit. Yep. Yes, absolutely. You can talk about the RFK Jr. chap. Very, very. Let me make one remark, because this is difficult, and there are also conspiratorial narratives here, but then there are mainstream narratives that may need to be challenged and put down from 100% to 80% in terms of their veracity. I'm not going to do that now, but Here's what I would say. When citizens reject things that are factually true, and I'm going to leave aside what is and what isn't factually true for now, make a distinction between them being ignorant of the facts because they're irrational or stupid. It's a disgrace how much we call voters stupid, actually. Moral disgrace. And deplorable. Moral disgrace. There's a difference between people being ignorant and people resisting a truth. Right? So let's make a very clear fact. Donald J. Trump lost the 2020 election. Some people think he didn't. When I'd ask them if I were an American citizen, which I'm not, to change their mind, what would I be asking them? Would I be asking them to correct an epistemic mistake? Is that what I'd be asking? No. I'd be asking them to change something that goes to the core of how they understand their political agency. They're going to experience my request to admit what I see as the truth there, rightly as the truth, as an attack on their political agency. And that's a reflection of the fact that in today's societies, we have a genuine, not a made up, a genuine conflict between political agency and truth. And that conflict is produced not by bad political leaders, not by dumb citizens, not just by the disinhibiting effects of the internet, but by various social forces about which we need to talk about. And the image here is society is doing this as opposed to doing that. Social forces are responsible for the conflict we're living through between truth and political agency. And you yourself are engaging in a depoliticized way in politics when you simply scream, "You ignorant morons, can't you admit these obvious facts? The earth is not flat. Stop saying that it is," right? There's a few issues on which citizens are so glaringly factually wrong that it's almost close to saying the earth is flat. But this is not an epistemic disagreement. We're not in a philosophy seminar. These are citizens who feel that recognizing certain establishment narratives is inconsistent with the formation of any kind of sense of political agency given the lack of trust they have. They feel that understandable lack of trust, right? And so that is why it's not just okay to talk about this particular character on the Rogan pod and Rogan's conflict with Hotez. It's really essential. It's a very important conversation. If we then move on and say, well, should Mr. Hotez have agreed to go on the Rogan podcast as a scientist, debate JFK as a non-scientist about a matter of science? That's a fascinating question, and there's a tension there. And I'll talk about this properly, but not now. For now, I'll just make one comment. The tension is that you actually don't debate science. And I'm not going to elaborate that thought that's going to be jarring for some of you. But either the peer-reviewed literature points to something or it doesn't. The only way to debate it is to further add to that literature. And that suggests that you absolutely can debate people about what liberalism is or what socialism is, but you can't debate people about whether climate is changing because of human behavior, for example. That's not something you can debate. That's something that the science shows is true, or it doesn't. And it does. And some people don't agree with that, but they're wrong. But you can't debate that, on the one hand. On the other hand, we face a massive crisis of trust. And these conversations do need to happen. And you can't just leave citizens hanging or coming out and saying, this is false, I'm not going to believe it, even if they're wrong. So an option for Mr. Hottes could have been to, and it's not his personality, to recognize that depth on the other side rather than dismiss it as a bunch of misinformation being peddled by naughty people, even though it may indeed be untrue. So what you say is, okay, I'm going to come on, but I'm going to talk as though the science isn't up for debate. And I'm also going to bring somebody on with me. I'm going to bring a philosopher. I'm going to bring on Mark Liller. I'm going to bring on Michael Ignatieff. And then we are going to debate why we're facing such a big crisis of trust and why the most interesting thing about this conversation is the impossibility of having it properly, right? So there is a tension there. You don't debate science. Science just is itself a debate that happens in a very coercive corridor of institutional procedure. But on the other hand, you have to have conversations when there's absolutely catastrophic loss of trust and expertise. You can't just say it's irrational to lose trust, so bye-bye, we're not talking to you. That's not politics. Citizens have lost trust, and it's actually understandable why they have. Rant over for the moment. It's an absolute moral disgrace, the terms in which we discuss Trump voters, for example, right? Absolutely morally disgraceful and profoundly counterproductive. Vlad, what are your overall thoughts on monarchies? Do you think they serve any good for their nations? Do monarchies have any role in a present-day world? So, David, I don't think that's a question that you can answer in the abstract. You know, human beings certainly need food and water and shelter and community. But there's no sense in which they need monarchy the same way. So whether they need monarchy depends on the context. And it's absolutely appropriate to be a monarchist in one country and an anti-monarchist in another. This is not something about which it is healthy to have a sort of ubiquitous position. My personal attitude as somebody who has been a British citizen for a quarter century is that I am about as interested in the royal family as I am in chewing cardboard, but I'm not offended by chewing cardboard. But inevitably, I have an analytical interest in them. And one of the interests I have in them is that they are, but are now ceasing to be, but let's say they are, one of the last institutions that still gathers bipartisan trust and support. And one of the issues here is, how does Charles not lose that? The Queen kept it largely through an almost pathological kind of coldness and austerity, in how she conducted family relations and how she conducted her own life. Now, that has allowed a Guardian reader and a Sun reader and a Telegraph reader to be monarchists at the same time. So in a world in which institutions are declining, if you have a monarchy that still gathers enough trust that could become a very powerful argument for preserving it. Does something like the structure of this argument apply reasonably well to the UK today? Yeah, it does. Therefore, the anti-monarchist position in the UK is legitimate. It's a legitimate ethical position, but it is politically weak. But paradoxically, could become politically stronger if the monarchy gets increasingly politicized. Um, and there's a risk that that'll happen with Charles. Mark is saying if the climate is changing, there isn't convincing evidence that humans caused it. So my position in this community is that you're very welcome with that position into this community, but as a factual claim, I'm not going to indulge it. Um, there has not been debate about this in the scientific community for a long time, and this is a settled fact that um, there is human influence climate change, and indeed the fossil fuel companies knew about it very well and tried to cover it up, and we know about that well too. So Mark, you're wrong. You're welcome to keep saying that in this community, but I won't indulge you by suggesting that there is a chance that you're right. You're misinformed, and your opinion is interestingly a product of something I don't know what it is. It could be partly a lack of a lack of wherewithal in informational environments. Or don't mean to be condescending, but there is no debate on this issue. You could debate something else. You could debate um, what the social response will be to the changes in the climate that are humanly mediated. That's open. We don't know what that's going to be. And we've got to be honest here. And indeed, it could be that the climate crisis turns out to be less catastrophic than some people think, but the social response to it is more catastrophic. And it could be that the climate crisis turns out to be more catastrophic in the just climatic changes, um, but the social response to it will be less catastrophic. So we've got to be very careful, and this is where climate activists go wrong, that they conflate what the science, what parameters the science gives us for where the climate's going. That's one issue, and how the social world will respond to climatic changes is another issue. So you can never say things like science says that 70 wars will happen, that are going to kill 500 million people. No, you can't say that. Science doesn't say anything about that at all. That's a matter of social understanding. But or it could be your position, Mark, that you simply don't trust the institutions that have generated that knowledge. And then we're back to the previous conversation about how that debate should proceed, right? And there, despite my firm response to you, I would be very much against you being dismissed and you being condescended about this. Because your distrust in institutions here may not be groundless. It may not be framed in exactly the right way, but it may not be groundless. So that's a community guideline, as it were. I welcome you deeply if you do not believe in humanly influenced climate change. But if you can't deal with me saying that I will not accommodate or indulge that position, unsubscribe and leave the community now. But again, I'm going to be the last person to sit around and being categorically, as a group, dismissing and making jokes at the expense of people who deny human influence climate change. I take these people very seriously, and I don't think it's these people. I think it's very different things that are at work. And It's up to you. You're very, very welcome, but I'm not going to say that it's a 50-50 issue. Um, what there is much more room to debate is how societies respond, right? Um, whereas what the climate does is not something we debate, it's something science debates with itself. So if you want to challenge something, you just need to make a contribution to to a scientific literature that contradicts some of what's come before. That's the only way that thing rolls. Sorry, I've been mean, but that's my position. Meow dog. Vlad, what would it take for Russia to wake up to the fact that corruption in Russia is not the same as in the West? Or do you think they already know? They already know. And they already know that they're doing catastrophes in Ukraine. So it's not, for the depoliticized blob, it's not so much about waking up. It's about not, yeah, I was a bit mean now. Susanna was a bit mean now. Um, Vlad, what would it take for us to wake up? I think that for the depoliticized blob, it's not about waking up. It's about denial and avoidance. You see, that's different. It's not like, oh, I didn't realize this was true. Now I realize it's, I'm not looking there. I think bad things are happening, but I shouldn't look there because it's very bad for me to look there. That there's a difference, you see, right? And they know that there's catastrophic. They know that there is catastrophic corruption. But this knowledge needs to be politically mobilized as it is. Mark, you're responding to me, and I just want to reiterate you're very welcome in the community, and I'm grateful to have you. Does that, meow dog, does that, do you get the difference, right? You're talking about denial rather than lack of information. And when it comes to corruption, not just generally waking up to what's going on, when it comes to corruption, it's people know all too well. And that's interestingly why Mr. Navalny's popularity and his capacity to access not just the liberal folks in Russia has been driven by his corruption message, which is now a tricky message because you need a different message now that all hell is breaking loose. You can't just do the anti-corruption message. And he's recently been moving past that. So that's what I have to say, meow dog, about that. They know about it, but you need to politicize that knowledge and mobilize people. Was Boris Nemtsov too pro-privatization, too pro-neoliberal? Rachel, I wonder how many people know who Boris Nemtsov was. So Boris Nemtsov was killed in February, early February 2015, I think, 8 years ago, outside of the Kremlin. He's walking with his girlfriend, having just done an interview at Echo Moscow. And the editor of Echo Moscow was trying to get him not to leave and walk around without security. And he was followed by a bunch of Chechens, and he was followed by the FSB. He was the most Russian of all of the Russian opposition leaders in the healthy sense. There's a sort of unhealthy sense of being Russian. Boris was in a healthy sense Russian. He was sort of authentic, unbuttoned, free, a kind of more modern and a less destructive version of Boris Yeltsin. He was sort of a concentration of Yeltsin's best qualities without his worst qualities. And he had a wonderfully kind of naive relationship with life, but also with ideas. So just like he thought sex was good, he thought liberty was good. Boris, why is liberty good? Are you nuts? It's good. Um, and that's quite a distinctively Russian and therefore alien to me way of thinking. Alien to me in the sense that it's not mine. It's not alien to me in the sense that I don't understand it and can't identify it. Was it too pro privatization and too pro neoliberal? Yes, but I mean the tendency is that much of the Russian opposition, though they don't think in these terms, are kind of center right. It's changing a bit now, but they used to be pretty center right. I have a definition of neoliberalism, which is that I don't recognize it as an actual political position, even a political tag you critically ascribe to some others. For me, neoliberalism, and I think did I say that? I think I said that on to you on Twitter. I think of neoliberalism as a magical thinking mediated commitment to the primacy of the market. So if somebody says to me, Vlad, I've written a PhD thesis on the primacy of the market, I'm not going to call them a neoliberal. But if somebody has a kind of faith in it, that is just partly in the subconscious, if you like. Yeah. And is this faith that markets do it better a big part of life in modern societies? Yes, it is. So the 20th century has demonstrated these two faiths. One's been much more destructive than the other. One faith was the state should do everything, and that faith has done a lot in the instantiations it took to kill millions of people. But there is also the faith that I would argue has killed quite a few people too, but many, 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 many fewer, and in much less of a um, uh, morally depraved way. But nevertheless, the magical thinking faith that um, the market is better without needing to think about it, that also has done enormous damage. The real answer is, once we depathologize this, it's a piecemeal question whether the market or the state does something better. Look at the damn thing and see if the damn thing in the damn particular context is done better by the state or by the market. And we have had an historical incapacity, and we're still in the grip of that incapacity to think about that freely. So Obinals, thank you. Eric, does Vlad believe in the value of sleepy bedtime? Vlad is misbehaving toward his European audience here by keeping them up inappropriately. So they shouldn't be with him now. Yes, Eric, you're completely right. Edmund, you often talk about dark forces. Vlad, could you expand on that a bit? I'm not sure I 100% get what you mean. What I would say is that we've got to recognize human negative capability as well as human positive capability. There is a sort of illusion whereby we tend to think that human beings doing terrible things is human beings trying to be good but failing. But there is also such a thing as the quest for power, the quest to destroy, the quest to take joy in suffering. These are parts of human nature too. We have destructive capabilities. Often these capabilities have come out catastrophically within states too, and we've seen that in 20th century Europe. But often they come out in between states because affairs between states are the least regulated human affairs. Let's have a look. Tom, I don't know what your question is. Let me just read it and see. Vlad, you said that Navalny would be responsible for his moral luck. Well, he could be a victim of his moral bad luck if a protest turns out bad. Does moral responsibility not arise from the consequences of a choice that one does or should foresee? No, I don't think so. We are responsible for things we didn't cause. Ilya Yashin, the Russian opposition leader, who is in jail now for calling Bucha a genocide, talking about what happened in Bucha. He's in jail now for years for that. He is responsible for Russia's war in Ukraine as a Russian citizen. But he hasn't done anything to cause it. In fact, he has worked really hard to stop it. But he is responsible. And it's because he recognizes that he's responsible that he's actually taken this extraordinary act of going to prison. Richard, one key problem is that there's far, far too many men in charge of things rather than women. I'm a very big fan of Mark Fisher. On the climate, you're offering platitudes now. You're offering imprecise statements, deliberately obscure statements that if I received them in a master's or undergraduate essay, I would reject them. I would ask the thing to be rewritten. That's true of several of your last comments. So moderate that, okay? Because we're talking about a central global challenge, a challenge that's impacting people. It's making a lot of people suffer. It's going to make also many more people suffer, the climate crisis. So don't tell me science doesn't give us absolute truths. Don't give me platitudes that can be knocked down in 2 seconds flat. Okay. And I can see very clearly when you're saying things that aren't yours. These are not sufficiently your thoughts. So there's no way I can blast you out of not believing in human influence climate change, but you've got to give more indication of thinking for yourself on this, even if you're thinking for yourself for this while maintaining your position. Okay. That was too transparently fluffy. You don't get to get away with that. So in terms of moral luck, yeah, I think we're not we're responsible for things. I mean, let me just put it like this. If I'm, if I run over a child while driving carefully, slowly, soberly, and the child just jumps out from behind the vehicle, I'm going to be ethically implicated. It's not because I am irrational. You see, a kind of utilitarian philosopher might tell me that I'm irrational to be awake at night after running over a child, having done nothing wrong as a driver. But the fact that I'm going to be ethically impacted for life by that, thank God that's never happened to me. And I hope it doesn't happen to any of you, right? But when this sort of thing happens to us, we can't be serious and say that our ethical reaction is irrational. Of course, it's not irrational. So we are responsible. For things we did nothing to cause sometimes. Let's have a look. 1.5 hours. I think I have messed around with your time and your patience already quite a bit. So let's begin to gently wind up. And maybe fish out a single question or two. Dilswaggins is saying, do you follow Stephen Kotkin a bit? Yes, a very, very admirable historian. I have great respect for. Do you think the Ukrainian war is likely to end similar to the Korean armistice? Well, I can tell you this. What we're looking at is very uncertain at the moment. Very, very uncertain. But the main scenario is at the moment certainly not Russia losing Crimea and losing all of its territory that it stole from Ukraine back to Ukraine. That could happen, but that's not the main scenario that we should reasonably, but with enormous uncertainty, guess as being the one we're heading for. Um, what it looks like we're heading for is some kind of a partially frozen war that could last a very long time. And I believe it's up to us to minimize the odds of that being the outcome that takes place, that occurs, even if it is of the 5, 6, 7 scenarios, probably the most likely or the least unlikely. So, however, unlike Stephen Kotkin, I'm a bit more optimistic about both a Ukrainian victory and the West's capacity to bring it about. But because he's a serious commentator, even though I wouldn't necessarily say he's an expert on the Kremlin in its current state, he's an expert on making historical comparisons. What I would say is that I can't immediately, I've said this before already, immediately place the source of my disagreement with him, which is a very healthy sign. All the healthiest disagreements are they're intellectual disagreements. They're disagreements where you can't exactly place where the disagreement occurs. If you can place it, you don't need each other. You can just reconstruct the other person's position for yourself, and then the debate adds nothing. But where debate is interesting is where you can't place the disagreement, but you can keep exploring it. Um, and I think there could be a kind of a Soviet studies. This is rude to say about Stephen Kotkin, but there could be a bit of a Soviet studies prism through which Stephen sometimes could be at risk of seeing this. And I am therefore critical of it. But he'd have something to answer to what I've said. David is saying don't block people's ideas. Here's what I would say. Look, we do need experts to insist on demonstrable matters of fact. But we don't want experts to excessively comment off duty. There's a concept of experts commenting on duty and off duty. So I don't know. Not gonna say real things that make things up. Richard Dawkins's view on the Ukraine war. I don't even know what it is, but it's not a professional view. He doesn't have a view as a public science communicator and as a scientist with a background in evolutionary biology, perhaps evolutionary psychology. He is off duty if he comments on that. It's very important. Just like Mr. Hottes is on duty if he comments about public health interventions and their safety, but he's off duty if he comments about social justice groups protesting during lockdown. That's an off-duty comment. Experts need to minimize off-duty comments at a time when there is a massive crisis of trust, and they need to be more confident with their on-duty comments and more minimal with their off-duty comments. That absolutely includes scientists commenting on the social implications of matters of scientific fact. That's very, 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 very important. One of the things that we saw actually on several sides is that distinction becoming very broken during public discourse around COVID, partly because actually epidemiology is a constellation potentially of several forms of expertise, which includes social expertise too. And anytime humans are asked to engage in expertise that involves biological science and then social understanding, there's precarity. That is why psychiatry, for example, another profession that is in epistemic crisis, because psychiatrists are trying to bring together biological understanding, clinical understanding, social understanding, and psychoanalytic understanding, or at least psychological understanding. That puts great strain on their profession, and exposes them to complete epistemic collapses, which often are very practically damaging. And that's just not the case with cardiologists. Cardiologist does not need to know anything about social or economic things. So we've got to be very, very strict about expertise. The trouble here are philosophers, because the philosopher's expertise is around the question of where people's expertise ends and begins. That's a philosophical question. So a philosopher is expert on who is an expert on what. And that's a dreadfully arrogant thing to say, but I'm afraid that is a philosophical expertise. It doesn't mean philosophers aren't going to be preponderantly wrong about that, but they're professionally wrong. They're making a professional error because their profession asks them to get it right. So it's not that philosophers are magical, it's that their duties are very demanding, which means they're also going to fail quite a bit. So we've got to be really, really tight about expertise. If it's in our lane, be strong about it. If it's not in our lane, really, really, really scale down how much you insist on knowing what you're talking about. Let's say 2 more questions, and then I am going to let you guys go. Alpa Chino. Vlad, I've recently listened to a talk from Ekaterina Schulman. Would you agree with the premise that there's a large gap in terms of values between the older and younger generation in Russia? That's what I've just said. It's the single biggest dividing line in Russian society. It's more important than anything else. There's an absolutely apocalyptic generational gap on a weird scale in Russia. And we're seeing that. And part of the reason that Putin started this war, Kater Schulman likes to say, is that he realized the next generation, the younger generation, aren't with him. So he wanted to disenfranchise them and go over the top and militarize and mobilize society and make sure that his sort of program didn't run out of steam for the next generation. So that generational gap is something Putin is conscious of, and it's part of his thinking behind starting this war. Franklin, you are the last question. Make it good. Let's have a look. Markets are efficient. At what? You can see this in how no one consistently beats the line in sports betting. So I'm not going to pull up, I mean, I'm not going to try to eat you alive for your comment and say 7 mistakes that are in it. Let me just respond constructively then. Markets are efficient. Democracy is a market mechanism too. If by that you mean something to do with the marketplace of ideas being left sufficiently unhindered, generating truth, then you're wrong. Truth is only generated by very coercive procedures. Look at scientific discourse, for example. It is extraordinarily coercive and institutional. What it takes for a paper to question another paper. So that can be corrupted too. Some people feel it has been corrupted. And broadly speaking, I don't think it has. But there could be some issues. But scientific discourse is enormously ritualized, constrained, restricted conversation where to enter it, you have to meet very, very special conditions. It's not a marketplace of ideas. A marketplace of ideas in the world of the kind of internet we have is compatible, as I once said, I said several times actually in our conversations, and I'm stealing this from several people, one of them is probably the philosopher Bernard Williams, is compatible with the generation of a set of villages only constituted by village idiots, because the solitary village idiot in each village unites with the solitary village idiot in all the other villages, and they form their own villages. So I'm not saying you're saying this, but if you were saying that the marketplace of ideas generates truth, then you are dramatically underestimating how elitist adequate epistemic procedure is and how dependent it is on various kinds of institution and ritual. Moreover, notions of efficiency, if we talk about how governments work, need to be responsive to certain kinds of imaginative visions that aren't going to be themselves produced by the market. And it's the Western intervention in Ukraine is itself an example of that. It is criticized by folks all over the place who think we should support Ukraine more and so on, sure, but it is nevertheless an extraordinary application of political imagination that challenges the normal operation of government, the normal operation of government departments. If only we could be as imaginative and as radical in the way we think about how we organize our healthcare systems, in the way we think about how we organize our education systems, as we have been about how we support Ukraine. So, for policy to be adequate, it needs to be driven by projects imbued with a kind of imagination and social vision that is not going to be the product of something that a market generates. I could have answered none of your question, and I could have simply misunderstood your question. So, If I have, let's come back to it another time. Sleeping Beauty, thank you. Yes, you're aware that I'm drinking electrolytes, strawberry electrolytes. Bit too sweet. Michael, I'll take your question because you just got it in on time. Let's say that, and then we'll definitely end. If there is a nuclear power plant disaster that happens due to risk pushed beyond the brink, but not by direct, discrete action by Russia, how will or should the West react? The West, in broad terms, will elevate in its collective perception the degree to which Russia is a threat to it and not just Ukraine as a result of any nuclear incident. I don't think it's going to pass as easily as Kakhovka has for Russians. There's a kind of imperceptible nature to the tragic catastrophes that Kakhovka has generated. It's not going to be the same with a nuclear, with any kind of nuclear incident, even if it is unobvious how directly it was done by the Russians. So I think that is something that's going to activate the West to move closer toward the sorts of positions I elaborate at the end of that 7-minute video that's on the last video on the main channel, which is about staying with Ukraine longer, staying with Ukraine more. Is the West going to do a no-fly zone as a result of that over Ukraine? No. Is the West going to enter the war directly? No. But its commitment and support for Ukraine will come closer without still getting to that destination which says we're fully behind the Ukrainian victory. And that is partly why that now could work against Russian interests and actually for Ukrainian interest in the long term, but that'll be at grave cost. So that's a sort of a flimsy attempt at an answer, Michael. I hope that's okay for you, everybody. Lots of love. Obviously, you're going to have to get some awards for surviving so many rants from me in this one. But it's been a pleasure to have you, and we're going to be back talking together very soon. Lots of love to you all. Good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening, good night. I apologize for the questions I didn't take. I hope to do more next time. Rachel is asking about mod power. I think that's a good idea. So I'll get back to you on that. So kind of you to be so generously involved. Everybody, thank you. Good night. Good night. Red hearts, orange heart, sunflowers. Bye, 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 everybody.